Half past the hour, the Republican-led House Oversight Committee today will hold its first impeachment hearing on President Biden. And yesterday, the House Ways and Means Committee voted along party lines to release 700 pages of documents from IRS whistleblowers regarding Hunter Biden's business dealings. Republican Committee Chair Jason Smith of Missouri pointed to a June 6, 2017 WhatsApp message in which Hunter Biden wrote to a business associate that he was not willing to, quote, sign over my family's brand. Smith cited the message as, quote, evidence of corruption and misconduct. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles followed up on that, seeking clarification and explanation about the timing of that message, leading to this exchange with the Republican congressman.
And then the WhatsApp message you have, I believe, is dated June 6, 2017. Joe Biden is not vice president or even a candidate for president at that time. So where is the direct connection to some sort of criminal malfeasance within these two pieces of evidence?
Well, I think the facts speak for themselves. There's over 700 pages of examples of where people should be very concerned.
Can you explain the timing then of the August 6th WhatsApp message? Why is that evidence of some wrongdoing?
I'm not an expert on the timeline. I would love to have President Biden and his family to tell us about all the timelines, because it's really, really unfortunate that we see so many meetings and so many phone calls that involved around official activity that the vice president has been participating in, and then big sums of money follows later.
But if he's not the president or the vice president at that time, where's the wrongdoing? He wasn't even a candidate for president at that time.
He was a candidate.
In August 6th of 2017?
Apparently, what source are you with?
I'm with NBC.
So apparently you'll never believe us.
I'm not saying I don't believe you. I'm asking you a very direct question. You presented a piece of evidence that you say came on August 6, 2017, that demonstrates that Joe Biden was using political influence to help his son. If he wasn't a political figure at that time, the first WhatsApp message you put up, where you talk about the brand, and I'm completely open-minded about this. I'm asking you specifically, how does that demonstrate that there's some sort of political influence being put over him if at that time he's not an elected official?
I'm definitely not going to pinpoint one item. I think we've outlined.
You presented it. It was your first thing that you brought up.
So apparently you don't agree with it. So
it's not that I don't agree with it. I'm asking you to explain it.
I'll take the next question.
And the man you just heard running circles around that member of Congress, NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, joins us now live. Ryan, good morning. So tell us about the backstory of this WhatsApp message, because you were clearly just asking a fact-based question that the member of Congress had not considered the date that Joe Biden held no power at the time of that message. So just for our viewers, what is the story? What is the backstory?
Well, Willie, I've been particularly obsessed with this idea of timeline when it comes to the information and the evidence that the Oversight, Ways and Means and Judiciary Committee has put out as it relates to Hunter Biden, because over time and time again, they keep attempting to establish this connection between Joe Biden and his son. And a lot of the information that they presented comes during that period of time where Joe Biden is not the president or vice president of the United States. He's not the president of the United States. And in the case of this WhatsApp message, he isn't even a candidate for president. And so they demonstrate this, though, as a way to show that Hunter Biden was trading on his father's name around the country, and that somewhere along the line that there was then this extension of this financial benefit that Joe Biden himself benefited from. So what I was simply asking there is, if you think that this is an example of the unfair use of an office, of a political office being used at the benefit of someone in your family, what does this timeline tell us about that? And they really didn't have an answer for that. And I think in certain aspects, it's just kind of throwing stuff at the wall, making it look as though there's a real problem here. But then when you actually drill down on the timeline of all of it and how it's connected to both the stuff that Hunter Biden has done, what Joe Biden was doing at that time, there isn't really that specific connection that would demonstrate a high crime or misdemeanor. Because keep in mind, that would be the bar that they have to cross in terms of an impeachment inquiry inquiry if they move to articles of impeachment. And the other point I should point out, too, Willie, is that the other piece of evidence that they provided yesterday was an email from a career prosecutor in the Department of Justice that came from these IRS whistleblowers that suggested that Joe Biden should not be a part of the investigation. The political figure one should be removed from the conversation of a search warrant that they were looking for at that time. That particular piece of that email was dated in August of 2020. They were suggesting that the Department of Justice was somehow giving Hunter Biden preferential treatment on behalf of Joe Biden. Well, in August of 2020, Bill Barr was the attorney general. Yes. Donald Trump was the president. So they keep talking over and over again about these two-tiered systems of justice, but then they're providing evidence that comes from a period of time where the Trump Justice Department was in charge. And again, I am open-minded to this. If they are able to provide that direct piece of evidence that would explain to us why they believe that Joe Biden was benefiting from the work of his son, present it. At this point, at least I haven't seen that specific smoking gun.
Well, you sort of answered my next question for you, Ryan, which is in a couple of hours in that building behind you, the Oversight Committee is going to hold an impeachment hearing led by Chairman James Comer, who famously said, well, there's a lot of smoke here. We don't have fire yet, but we believe there's a lot of smoke. That seems to be sort of the theme of this investigation. Have you, in your reporting, as an excellent reporter, have you found anything that shows you a connection between Hunter Biden's business dealings and the President of the United States?
There isn't that hard piece of evidence that if you presented it in a court of law would convict someone. And I think that's the important part of this. And I do believe that there are two different conversations to be having here. There's an ethical, moral, and political conversation, and then there's a legal question. And when you're talking about moving to articles of impeachment, I think we're all not naive to the fact that impeachment is a political exercise, but you really do need the legal evidence to try and nail that down in a way that would really allow you to use the force of the government to potentially remove a president from office. And, I think there are a lot of questions about what Hunter Biden was doing around the world and perhaps doing it in the name of his father, or at least under the banner of the Biden family. But there has to be more than just Joe Biden was on a speakerphone when Hunter Biden called him. Hunter Biden was on a speakerphone when he called his father when he was around his business associates. You need more than that to establish a direct connection. And so one of the things that this impeachment inquiry is going to do is that they're going to collect bank records from many of the Biden family associates, James Biden, the president's brother, and Hunter Biden. Perhaps there is where we're going to be able to find that smoking gun piece of evidence. If there's a bank transfer that goes into a bank that's specifically controlled by the president, perhaps then we would have that answer. But again, and this is why I say I'm obsessed with this, we go back to the timeline. Even if something like that is established, if Joe Biden isn't the president or the vice president at that time, is that illegal? So, there's going to be a lot of things that they bring up here today during this hearing, but I think we do need to drill down on the specifics of it and how all those things connect in this web that they're trying to build here.
NBC's Ryan Nobles doing a great job explaining all this for us. Ryan, thanks so much. We really appreciate it.